first, let's take a closer look at yesterday's Closing the Gap targets, because there's a fair bit of history here and a fair amount of detail and plenty of politicking, as you might expect. First of all, I think it's a good thing these targets have been revisited, given the original targets were set back in 2008 by Kevin Rudd. And it's also good that this time there's been quite significant consultation with Aboriginal people to design the targets. But that fact alone doesn't make them sound. Originally, the Rudd targets focused on some of the obvious indicators of Aboriginal disadvantage: poor health, poor employment, and poor housing. Unfortunately, despite massive effort and spending and an abundance of goodwill on all sides of politics, there's been very little progress. Two areas of positive change, positive improvement: more Aboriginal people are finishing school and more Aboriginal people are graduating from university. But all the other targets in terms of life expectancy, employment and housing, well, these things have barely changed despite, as I said, all levels of government, the goodwill and the spending. Indeed, the spending on a per capita basis is roughly double spent on Aboriginal people than on other Australians. So the effort's there, but not the results. Of course, when dealing with social dysfunction, everything's connected to everything else. So unstable relationships tend to be associated with poor employment, which tends to be associated with poverty, which tends to be associated with substance dependence, and so on. Now, that's consistent across a range of households in this country, not just Indigenous. As a country, we can't change the family people are brought into, or in many cases, the place where people grow up, but we can ensure that all people have the best possible prospects. And that begins with a decent education. I come from a very small country town. In my primary school class, there were just 6 of us. And we had just one teacher for every subject. No computers, no screens, just a blackboard. We didn't even have a photocopier. But what made all the difference for me was a teacher who wanted to teach and parents who wanted me to learn. That and the fact that missing school was never an option. For many Aboriginal children, the resourcing could be as similarly poor as my school, but where they're let down is that the system doesn't demand they go to school. Too often we lower our expectations when it comes to Indigenous children. We let things slide for them that we'd never accept in schools elsewhere, and that's criminal. On average, Australian school attendance rates are about 91%. That's not great, because it means that the average child misses half a day of school every week. But for Aboriginal children, the average attendance is 81%. And that equates to Aboriginal children missing roughly 1 full day of school each week, year in, year out. But it gets worse. For remote Aboriginal kids, school attendance is just 64%, which means that those children, on average, miss nearly 2 days of school each and every week for the whole time they're supposed to be in the education system. Or more likely, a small minority have reasonable attendance, but a large group hardly attend school at all. And we know that poor education is generally linked to high rates of unemployment, poverty, substance abuse and crime. Back in 2014, when Warren Mundine was the head of the Prime Minister's Indigenous Advisory Council, the then Prime Minister Tony Abbott insisted that a new target went into the old Rudd Closing the Gap reports. And that target was for school attendance. It was that Aboriginal kids had to attend school at the same rate as the rest of the Australian student population, and that target had to be met within 5 years. It wasn't a target on the never, it was 5 years. Well, within a year of the target being set, Abbott was gone. He was replaced by Malcolm Turnbull. Mundine was removed as well. From then on in, progress on school attendance was patchy at best, mostly because of a reluctance to insist on the importance of children going to school. Predictably, this target, the only one that required real individual action from Indigenous parents, well, it was dropped yesterday. There's still a target to get 95% of Aboriginal children to school to finish school. But how can they finish school? How can that be a real target if there's no push to get them to go to school every single day? It's not surprising that two Indigenous leaders most disappointed with these targets today have been Jacinta Price and Warren Mundine. Along with Noel Pearson, they've been saying all the way along that you can't get Indigenous incarceration rates down unless we get Indigenous crime down, and you won't get Indigenous employment up unless we get Indigenous school attendance up. It was Pearson who also tellingly described welfare, or sit-down money as he said, as the poison that's killing our community, and who also asserted the right and duty of Aboriginal people to take responsibility, he said, for their own lives. There's none of that spirit today in the 47 pages released under the signatures of the PM and the Premiers, largely because it's been negotiated between a politically correct bureaucracy and 50 so-called peak Aboriginal bodies who think the problem here is entrenched systemic racism. Not the fact that not enough Aboriginal kids go to school, not enough adults are in work, and not enough families, particularly women, are kept safe. This document, to my mind, I've looked at a lot of government documents, it's all about process, not about outcomes. My real worry here is this is the sort of response we've seen time and time again from big organisations that are entirely dependent on government funding and are always seeking more money. What can be guaranteed from this is that there'll be more spending, more meetings, lots more statements, but there will be little, if any, meaningful change in the lives of people who need our help the most. I'd really love to hail this as a breakthrough, a game changer, a new beginning, but it's not. It's just more of what's got us into this sorry position where as a country we've never spent more trying to improve the lives of Aboriginal people, yet the outcomes don't match the reality. And all we've really done is just spawn an industry that profits from taxpayer spending rather than gives Aboriginal people more control, more say over their own lives and futures.